Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
It's good to be here. I was just thinking before we started, it feels like every analysis we do these days leads us back to these huge, fundamental behavioral challenges.
It really does. And this week is definitely no exception. We've gone through all the materials you sent in about global sustainability, population, and consumption.
A heavy topic.
A very heavy topic. And it all seems to circle around this one incredibly difficult question. Should we be restricting reproductive rights to control the global population?
Right.
I mean, we're at 8 billion people now. The projections say 10 billion by 2080. It just feels like something has to give.
It does, but I think we need to pause right there, because that initial question, while it seems logical, it might actually be pointing us in the wrong direction.
Okay, how so?
Based on all the data, the crisis isn't really the number of people, it's the lifestyle, it's the way we consume. So the real focus shouldn't be on population size, it needs to be on our patterns of consumption.
That's a huge distinction. So if it's not about how many we are, but how we live, can we quantify that? What's the real cost of our modern lifestyle?
We can. And the numbers are, well, they're pretty startling. Researchers ran a simulation, a really interesting one to make this exact point. They asked, what if everyone on Earth lived like the average person in a high-consumption country, let's say the United States?
Okay, so the full modern industrial lifestyle.
Exactly. In that scenario, to sustain our current 8 billion people, we would need 4.5 planet Earths.
4.5. Wow.
Yeah.
That number alone, it just stops you in your tracks.
It does. We are literally living on resources we don't have. Now, here's the other side of it.
Right.
The same simulation looked at what would happen if everyone lived like an average family in a very low-consumption nation, say somewhere like Somalia.
A much smaller footprint.
A tiny footprint. In that case, the Earth could actually support somewhere between 18 and maybe even 28 billion people.
So the planet can handle the people. It just can't handle the affluence. It's not a population crisis, it's a consumption crisis.
Precisely. And that leads to the next question.
Yeah.
Which is, why? Why are we stuck in this model? And the sources point to what they call a systemic pathology.
A pathology in the system itself.
Yes, the dominant economic structure, which you could call a form of socialized capitalism.
What do you mean by socialized capitalism? How does that drive this?
Well, it's a system where the risk is socialized, meaning taxpayers, the public, cover the losses, the bailouts. But the profit is privatized.
I see.
And because that system is fundamentally profit-driven, it has to grow. It needs perpetual expansion to be stable.
The machine has to keep getting bigger, no matter what.
No matter the cost. And this constant need for growth, for more markets, more profit, just for the sake of it. It's pathological. We've talked about this before. It's like the biology of a cancer cell.
Growth for growth's sake.
Exactly. It demands resources just to sustain its own replication, with no regard for the health of the host. In this case, the host is the planet.
So the system itself is a planetary cancer, and if we don't change that...
Then severe scarcity, resource wars, massive crises.
Yeah.
They're not just a possibility, they're an inevitability.
Okay, so if the answer is so simple on paper, just consume less, why is it so hard in practice? Why can't we just stop?
Because it runs right up against our deepest cognitive wiring, what you might call the insatiable mind.
Our factory settings.
Exactly. Humans are, at a fundamental level, an unsatisfied species. Even when all our basic needs are met, we're safe, we have food, shelter, our brains are programmed to want more. It's an ancient reflex.
Old software running on new hardware?
The perfect way to put it. You can see it in the simplest things. I mean, just ask yourself or anyone listening to go look in the refrigerator right now.
Yeah.
Chances are there's enough food in there for 5 days, maybe more. Why? We're not facing a famine. It's that hunter-gatherer psyche, always stocking up for the lean times that never come.
That instinct was a lifesaver 50,000 years ago, but now it's completely maladaptive in a world with supermarkets on every corner.
That's the core mismatch. Our hardware, our psychology, our biology is optimized for a world that doesn't exist anymore. This new industrial, urban world we've built is so deeply incompatible with our factory settings that it's causing immense harm to us and to the environment.
And a huge part of that is just how disconnected we become from nature itself.
It's staggering. Something like 70 or 80% of the world's population now lives in cities. We've forgotten that food isn't just a commodity you buy. It's an offering, a gift from a complex living biosphere.
We treat the planet like a vending machine instead of a living system we're part of.
We do. And that has a very real price, which brings us to the carbon footprint.
Right, we hear that term all the time. What does it really mean in the context of this global machine?
Well, it's basically the total amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that an activity releases. Nature has its own carbon cycle, a balance it maintains over millennia.
But we've thrown a wrench in it.
A massive one. Industrial production since the early 1900s has completely thrown that system out of equilibrium. We've accelerated a geological process into a crisis that's happening on a human timescale.
And the sources of that carbon are sometimes surprising. It's not just cars and factories.
Not at all. Think about our digital lives, which we tend to think of as clean or cost-free.
Okay.
A single Google search is responsible for about 7 grams of carbon emissions.
7 grams for one search. How?
Well, there's the power for your device, then the network transmission. But the big cost is the data centers, these enormous server farms that have to search through petabytes of information. They consume incredible amounts of electricity.
So if a search is 7 grams, I can't even imagine what streaming video or training these huge AI models must cost.
It's colossal. The energy consumption of some of these AI models is equivalent to that of a small city. This free activity has a very real, very heavy cost.
Which puts all the talk about green energy into perspective. How do we power all of this, even if we cut back?
And that leads us to the nuclear necessity debate. It's a real paradox. You look at the countries that are leading the charge on solar and wind, and very often they are also the biggest investors in nuclear energy.
Because renewables are intermittent. They're not a stable baseline power source.
Exactly. You need power 247 for a modern society to function. And if you look at it purely from a carbon per unit of energy perspective, nuclear is actually the cleanest option we have.
Despite all the fear around it, the accidents, the waste.
The waste disposal is a huge unsolved problem, no question. But the economic reality is stark. Without a stable baseline from something like nuclear, trying to run an entire country on renewables alone isn't really feasible. Not if you want energy independence.
So let's circle back to that first question then. If the problem is consumption, not population, what about the idea of legally restricting reproduction anyway, like China's former policies?
It just doesn't work. In fact, it tends to backfire spectacularly. There's a basic psychological principle at play. What is prohibited becomes attractive.
So trying to enforce it just creates other, sometimes worse social problems.
It does.
Yeah.
And you also see the complete opposite problem happening now in many wealthy, developed countries.
The wealth paradox.
Yes. In places all over Europe, governments are actually spending money on campaigns to try and increase birth rates. Their populations are aging, and their pension systems, their social safety nets, are on the verge of collapse because there aren't enough young working people to support the older generation.
It's like we're completely missing the real mechanism that controls population.
We are. The true regulator isn't government policy, it's biological stress. Look at what happens after a major disaster or war.
There's a baby boom.
A huge spike in reproduction. It's a deep evolutionary reflex to ensure the survival of the species after a major loss.
A biological panic button.
Right. And conversely, in times of high affluence and low anxiety, which describes many developed nations, birth rates naturally fall. The biological imperative just isn't as strong. So trying to manage population numbers is really just, it's futile. It ignores the real root causes, which are lifestyle and global income inequality.
This really changes how we should think about environmentalism, doesn't it? This whole idea that we have to save the planet.
I find that idea to be a form of intellectual arrogance, really. It's hubris.
To think we're that powerful.
Yes, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, has been here for maybe 50,000 years. We are a blink of an eye in geological time. The planet has gone through mass extinctions that wiped out over 90% of all life, all without our help.
It's like that old George Carlin bit. The planet will be fine. It will shake us off like a bad case of fleas.
That's a perfect summary. Nature will recover. The question isn't whether the planet will survive, it's whether we will. And a lot of modern environmentalism, frankly, is a parody. You have these massive tech companies talking about being zero carbon.
While selling us a new, more resource-intensive phone every single year.
Exactly. It's a marketing strategy. These nature protection societies should really be called human protection societies.
Right.
But even then, they rarely address the core issues: consumption, capitalism, and poverty.
And the conclusion from the sources on this is pretty grim.
It is. The trend suggests we're on track to be the shortest-lived human species.
So if systemic change seems unlikely, to put it mildly, what does that mean for the individual, for the person listening right now? Where do we go from here?
It means the focus has to shift from trying to change the world to building personal resilience. The best solution, the best defense, is to maintain a simple, small-scale life.
To reduce your dependency on these huge, fragile global systems.
Absolutely. The more complex your lifestyle, the more vulnerable you are. And paradoxically, it's the wealthiest communities, the ones who have never known scarcity, who will suffer the most when the systems break. They simply don't have the skills to adapt.
So what's the practical advice? What's the B plan?
Everyone should have one. It should involve some kind of access to land, or at the very least, a reliable source of clean water and basic self-sufficiency skills. And of course, only bringing children into this world that you know you can truly sustain.
And on a more immediate community level.
It starts right there. The most guaranteed way to slow down this collapse is local. It's asking your neighbor if they need help. It's building real, tangible community support.
Starting small is the best defense against a chaotic future. This has been an incredibly clarifying conversation, if a bit sobering.
It's a critical one to have, and it's important to remember that distinction, between analysis and solution.
Right. There's understanding the problem, and then there's fixing it.
Exactly. What we've done today is the analysis. The mechanics of the crisis are clear. The cognitive biases are clear.
So as we close, what's the final thought for our listeners? How do they move from that analysis to application?
The real challenge is to consciously adjust your own cognitive framework, to fight against those ancient factory settings that drive that insatiable desire. So I'd ask you to just think about one part of your life where you know you consume more than you need. Out of that old reflex, how can you apply what we've talked about today? That reliance creates fragility. To reduce your risk in just that one area, that's the start. Overcoming that self-imposed ignorance, one choice at a time, is the only real path forward.